Good morning, everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to the last day of this conference, which has been a great success so far. It is my great pleasure to introduce a professor in art, which is rather unusual for this kind of conference. And I believe that his work is more on the non-criminalistic side of forensics. Joris Dick was educated at the University of Amsterdam, did a stint in Los Angeles, and came back to the Netherlands to become a professor a while ago at the University of Delft. So without further ado, I would like to ask Joris to present his work that he's been carrying out at the University of Delft. Joris?
Thank you very much, Marcel. And thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to talk to you today for the next 30 minutes or so about art forensics, if you will, and the study of paintings. And in particular, I would like to talk about the authenticity study of paintings, which usually, if you look at it historically, has been the prime domain of art historians, but over the past couple of years, decades or two, has involved a number of other disciplines, right? So right now we have the similar sort of discipline relationships that that you have in forensics, where you have to deal with the legal system and police. So we have a similar combination of disciplines now in the field of authenticity studies. And the main question and sort of continuing fight is, of course, who is in charge of authenticating paintings, right? Who has the authenticity to say definite things about painting attribution, and so that's a continuing fight. My personal belief is that it's really in the collaboration of a number of disciplines together, and that's what I'm going to show to you today in a number of case studies. But the continuing fight, as you can see here, right, real or unreal, eye or chemistry, who's to decide whether artworks are real or not? And just to throw you into the deep immediately, here's a painting by Vincent van Gogh, which popped up on the art market a couple of years ago and was attributed to Vincent van Gogh. You see a couple of houses actually quite close to where you had the barbecue last Tuesday in Scheveningen, and the painting was X-rayed, and on the X-ray, as you can see here, you can see the upper half of a young lady knitting or peeling potatoes or doing something like this, and because of the analogy of this seated lady with a drawing that is kept elsewhere, and this drawing is safely attributed to Vincent van Gogh, the owners of the painting said, yeah, here's the smoking gun evidence for the attribution of the painting. This painting is still being debated, and the Van Gogh Museum, which is the lead authority in this case, hasn't really taken a final decision. But you can see that these substructures, right, sometimes hidden under paintings, where paintings have been painted on top of, play an important role in authenticity studies. And that especially applies to the work of the Dutch master Vincent van Gogh. It is estimated that about 1/3 of his entire oeuvre, so we're talking then about 300 paintings, 300 out of 900, have hidden paintings underneath, simply because the artist recycled his canvases, had the practice of taking a painting that he didn't like and he painted something on top of it. Happens quite a lot, and radiography, of course, is the perfect tool usually to visualize hidden structures. Here we have a painting attributed to Van Gogh in a private Dutch collection, and if you turn the painting upside down, you see what appears to be the portrait of Van Gogh himself. Looks like a self-portrait, we're not sure. And here already we see the first limitations of X-ray radiography, in that we're literally looking through the painting, and we're seeing paint layers stacked on top of each other, and that obviously blocks our view, obstructs our view on hidden paint layers, which makes things difficult to interpret. That also applies to this painting, a painting from the MFA in Boston by Vincent van Gogh from his later period in the south of France. And the X-ray of this painting shows something rather amorphous, as you can see on the lower left, difficult to interpret. There are some features that are clearly distinct from the surface painting, but it's unclear what this is pictorially, and only a comparison with the drawn oeuvre again pointed out that what we have underneath this painting is probably the oil version of a preliminary drawing, a study that Van Gogh made earlier, right? So that can sometimes help in the interpretation of X-ray images. And it's getting more and more difficult now. Here on the upper left we have an unfinished portrait kept in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and underneath the X-ray shows again something totally amorphous. It hasn't been identified what this is. The difficulty in interpreting these hidden images is also that you don't know what the orientation is, right? How do we need to look at it? What is up, what is down? Is this perhaps the hidden painting? Is it perhaps a detail from an originally larger canvas that was cut down? Or if the surface isn't finished, who tells us that the lower painting is finished, right? So that makes it all very difficult to interpret. But the main technical limitation in X-ray imaging is that the radiography is very sensitive for lead white, which is of course the main pigment on an artist's palette. But in the absorption domain of X-rays, lead is also pretty dominant, and it really outshadows the distribution of all kinds of other elements, pigments that are present on the painter's palette, right? So we get a very X-rays give us a very partial, colorblind, if you will, image of hidden structures. And this is not only limited to Van Gogh. There are all kinds of great minds, the great innovators in painting. They all used to recycle their paintings. And here on the lower right we have an example of a Picasso that has been changed. We believe that the painting holds up to 4 different paintings underneath the surface. As you can see, radiography doesn't really clearly visualize all these 4 different paintings underneath. And that also applies to this painting by Van Gogh, a patch of grass painted in Paris, summer of '86. If you turn the painting on its side and you look at the radiography, then we see the rather vague contours of a female head, as you can see. And the museum, in this case, was very interested in revealing the identity of this hidden face, which was too much blocked by the surface painting to clearly read in the radiography. Here and there we have areas of paint loss on the surface where we sort of could peek through the surface a little bit, and I can tell you when you look through this under the stereo microscope, your fingers begin to itch, and you really get the idea, okay, we want to see what is here. We know that this must have been the flesh tone of her cheek, as you can see here. And the museum allowed us to take a small sample from this painting. As you can see here, we removed a tiny bit of the painting. It's this thing here, and if you turn around that piece, then you're probably looking at the paint layer of our mystery layer here, right? We took a cross-section and then thought that this is the stratigraphy here. On the top we have a little bit of the grass landscape, then the white intermediate ground was probably a secondary priming layer to cover up the hidden face, and then finally the portrait of this figure underneath. SEM analysis told us that there are quite a few elements present, and here we did some further work with micro XRF synchrotron-based work showing the distribution of a number of elements. And interestingly, mercury and antimony, which relate to those two colors here on the artist's palette, appear to occur only in that hidden layer, right? So those are like elemental markers for our hidden painting. And we then thought, you know, if we have antimony and mercury in our hidden painting, right? Why not move away from X-ray absorption and try to visualize those two elemental markers by X-ray fluorescence? So what we did is we took our painting, and here you see the scheme of our setup. We took multiple point XRF readings from the painting that was moved in an XY direction through our pencil beam of X-rays, and we recorded the X-ray fluorescence coming from that spot. And for that, we transported the painting to the nearest synchrotron source in Hamburg, Germany. As you can see here, this is the painting in the setup, and this is the area that we scanned, right, with our fluorescence detector, and this is the incoming X-ray beam of the synchrotron site. And here I have a number of parameters of our scan, which took approximately 2 days to scan the entire surface of this area here. And so that gave us elemental distribution images of that area. And because we knew from the cross-section which elements were present in which layer, we got this three-dimensional model, which we could now start to peel off layer by layer. So zinc, as in zinc white, is something that occurs on the surface. As you can see, barium, probably a barium sulfate filler, also occurs on the surface. Then we have our intermediate, rather uniformly distributed layer of lead white, and underneath it we have the distribution of antimony, which nicely shows the hidden lady under the surface, as you can see. And because we mapped both the antimony, which comes from a yellow pigment, and mercury from a red pigment, we were also able to establish a sort of color reconstruction of this hidden painting, as you can see here. Two very distinct paintings then, if you look at it. A lady that is very much associated with the work of Vincent van Gogh in the Netherlands, right, in his period in Holland, whereas the surface painting is very much French and originates from Paris, right? The question, of course, is how can it be that those two very distinct paintings, right, distinct in terms of geography, in terms of style, in terms of chronology, are painted on top of each other? Right here we have our reconstruction, which nicely dovetails with a whole series of heads that Van Gogh painted in the winter of '84-'85, possibly as a study for his opus magnum of his Dutch period, the Potato Eaters, famous painting from his Dutch period. Van Gogh then moves to Antwerp, enrolls in the Art Academy. We'll talk about that in a moment. But then leaves soon. He was a very impulsive man. Leaves to Paris and joins his brother Theo van Gogh, who was an art dealer working in Paris. And the two brothers lived together for 2 years, and only in the second year a patch of grass is painted. Right. So the question is, how can it be that those two paintings are painted on top of each other? And the answer to that question really lies in the correspondence, the extensive correspondence between the two brothers, Theo and Vincent van Gogh, who wrote each other letters really almost on a weekly basis. And we found this nice little passage in March '85, where Vincent inquires whether a number of studies have arrived at Theo's place, which quite likely included this study here, which was sent off to Paris from Antwerp, from Holland, right? And then probably stayed all this time in Theo's bedroom. And Vincent then recycled it after he had moved in with him, right? So that is a nice sort of combination of art history, science, and let's say studies of Van Gogh's letters. We got quite some attention on this finding all over the world, but the nicest piece of coverage actually came from this gentleman over here, who in the evening news came up and said, "Yes, I know who this lady is. It's my grandmother." It's not true, but still very nice if you think you're doing. So this study that I just showed you was done a couple of years ago. Recently, in February this year, we presented our findings of this painting, another Van Gogh flower painting. Van Gogh was very much into flower painting in that summer of 86 and 87. You have to imagine that he moved away from Holland, where he painted all kinds of dark and somber-looking paintings, and then moved to Paris, was confronted with the Impressionists, and chose the subject of flower painting in order to practice the new colors, and to do all kinds of color studies. So he was very much obsessed with his theme. In those 2 years, he painted well over 300 flower paintings. So that's a lot. And this painting is from the collection of the Kruller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands, which holds in total 80 paintings by Van Gogh. It has a sort of difficult attribution history in the sense that it was first acquired as a Van Gogh by the museum in the 1960s. It was then rejected in the 1970s because of a few stylistical things. First of all, the size of the painting, it's about 1 meter by 80 centimeters, which is very large for Van Gogh paintings of that time. The art historians didn't like the signature on the upper right. Usually he signs on the lower left, may sometimes pay on the left, sometimes here, but never up there. That's what the art historians tell me. And then another thing that bothered the art historians was the exuberance of this flower still life. Usually his flower still lives are much simpler, and you see a vase with a couple of flowers, but not so much this rather Baroque display of various flowers. We had to look at this painting as well because there is something underneath the flower painting, as you can see here. We see two men. And we have, again, quite a big overlap in this conventional radiography image between the surface, notably, if we go back, between all these flowers that we have here, right, and the surface painting, which really hampers our ability to read the brushstrokes of the lower painting. That is something that the art historians wanted to do, because they thought that in learning more about this hidden painting, right, that would potentially lead us to the answer who made this painting and whether it was indeed by Van Gogh or not. We had a close look at this painting again with a handheld XRF machine by Broeker. So this is a portable handheld XRF unit which allowed us to establish the compositional, the elemental composition of the surface painting on a number of locations, and we then saw this rather large collection of pigments appearing on the surface, right, which would, by the way, be in line with this experimental behavior of Van Gogh during that period, where he really used multiple pigments for each color to try and master different pigment combinations in his work. The lower painting, where we have two men, right, is probably much simpler in terms of skin tones, right? These are, as we know, the color pigments that occur in skin tones in the work of Van Gogh. So these are the likely candidates, and then The difficulty is in the stratigraphy of the painting is this, right? Here we have virtually the entire periodic table of elements in our flower still life, 2 priming layers containing lead, which nicely sandwich our layer of interest, right? And all these elements then also occur in the flower. Yeah, so it's very difficult to, if you think of this, to image this hidden painting. And then our idea was not so much to look at the painting from the front, right, but from the back. And the idea was that the heavier elements, especially zinc and mercury, would perhaps be visible with X-ray fluorescence from the back of the painting. So here we see again our painting in Hamburg, at the Hamburg synchrotron site, which is basically a huge X-ray source, very intense X-rays. And you can see that we're scanning the painting, and we're using a number of fluorescence detectors to record the distribution of all these elements that we just saw. And we were only able to cover the painting partially because of this support cross that was, of course, in the way from the back of the painting. So we only have these 4 quadrants to look at. That's what you see here. And here is a very nice distribution of zinc, right? So we now clearly see that we are talking about two boxers that are shown here in a very classical academic study. And that's what we see here too. And this is a little bit of our a color reconstruction of what goes on underneath. And the question again is, how does this fit in the overall picture of what Van Gogh did? This, again, very classical and very academic study of two wrestlers. Stylistically, it would be very close to the Antwerp period. I just mentioned that Van Gogh moved to Antwerp and stayed in the painting academy for a very short period. It was way too rigid for him. He soon left to Paris, but he stayed for a couple of weeks in Antwerp, and during that period made all kinds of classical studies of plasters and things like this. And so that was the period to study closer, right, as far as the origin of these two wrestlers are concerned. And the smoking gun, again, was found in the letters of Van Gogh, because we found a letter dated January 28th, 1886 in Antwerp, where Van Gogh writes, "Ik heb het gruwelijk druk gehad. I've been dreadfully busy this week, because as well as the painting class, I go drawing in the evenings, and then after that go on and work from a model at a club from 9:30 to 11:30. I've become a member for no fewer than 2 of these clubs, and I now know 2 fellows who, to my mind, draw well, both Dutch." And here it comes. "This week I painted a large thing with 2 new torsos, 2 wrestlers, a pose set by Verla, and I really like doing that." So this is the direct link, right, to what we have shown in our study. And the tragic aspect of this is that while Van Gogh really liked what he did and liked his hidden painting, the 2 wrestlers, the teachers at the academy didn't, and he was told to go back to drawing class after this. He showed it to his teachers, and they didn't like it at all, and that's what made Van Gogh really upset and probably caused him to leave Antwerp and join his brother. So when looking at this painting here, that's one of the things that really drives me, is you get for a little moment the idea that you're sort of at an eye level with history, right? That you see, you're sort of looking over the shoulder of Van Gogh, and you see him work and make choices and develop himself as an artist. The painting, based on this analogy, was reattributed and is now on a very prestigious place again in the Köhler-Müller Museum in Antwerp, and that was released, as I mentioned, in February earlier this year. I would also like to talk a little bit, not so much about the authenticity of artwork and the relation, or let's say the use of X-ray fluorescence scanning in the authenticity of paintings. I would also like to talk a little bit about its role in the conservation of artwork, because paintings are restored every once in a while. There are hardly any artworks, right, that have sort of survived from the past in a virginal state, right? Something has happened with all these paintings in the course of time. And a rather dramatic example of that is what you see here. On the left, a painting by, self-portrait by Rembrandt, who also frequently painted on top of his own work, as we know now. And on the right side, you see a black and white photograph of exactly the same painting from the 1930s. And it's really it's the identical painting, but something happened, obviously, and the question is what? Today, we know, based on what Rembrandt scholars have learned over the past decades, today we know that Rembrandt frequently painted himself, right? There are many self-portraits, and we know that the function of these self-portraits was probably like a little bit like a business card or a marketing gift. We know that he gave away his self-portraits to important clients, and that he would also modify the portraits, his own self-portraits, according to the likening, according to the collection that these important clients had, right? So he would modify his paintings in order to fit into the collection of his important clients, because he would like to be there. He wanted his face to be in the collection of important collectors. That's what Rembrandt wanted. And that is probably what happened here. So the painting on the right is the original state of the painting, right? All kinds of modifications. Rembrandt turned into an exotic guy wearing a turban. And that is probably what we think now the original autograph version of the painting by Rembrandt, which in the 1930s was not recognized as such by restorers. Restorers saw that something else was present underneath the surface and then had the idea that they had to excavate the real Rembrandt. And that happened in a number of stages, right? So first they took off the turban, and then Rembrandt lost his long hair in the 1980s, and then finally, right, some of the eyes were changed, and this is what the painting looks like now. So this is the autograph version of the painting with various surface modifications made by Rembrandt himself, which were then taken off again in a number of conservation campaigns by conservators, right? Which of course is a big disaster, and it is now estimated that this painting, right, is about 80% by conservators and only 20% by Rembrandt. Yeah, so that is something that we want to avoid, and we need the right diagnostics, the right tools to learn what's present below the surface, right? If not, more of these things can happen. And we've been looking at this painting recently, a painting in the collection of the Mauritshuis here in The Hague, a late painting by Rembrandt. Saul and David playing the harp, right? King Saul crying because of the nice music of David. And this painting also has a rather strange history. If you look at the X-rays of this painting, then you can see that the painting, you can see the stretcher again, right? The nails on the side. But you can also see that the painting was cut in half, right? There's a seam here, and there's another one here. What happened? Somewhere in the 19th century, the director of the Mauritshuis decided that if you have a painting with two figures by Rembrandt, you can also turn that into two separate paintings by Rembrandt. It was cut in half, And the next generation of the Rembrandt, of the director's management of the Mauritshuis, then decided that that was probably a little bit too much, and let's put it back together. And of course, the upper part here was still missing, right? So another painting was cannibalized in order to sort of fit this like a jigsaw puzzle. You can see the arm of, if you look at it from the side, you can see an arm of something. So this comes from a totally different painting and was used as a sort of a patchwork to cover it all up. And I put the painting back together. And we also know that a piece of 30 centimeters is missing here, right? So the painting has shrunk a little bit. Really, of course, according to modern standards, big abuse would never happen now. But the problem is that we have this painting, which is not only cut apart and glued back together, stitched back together, it is also heavily overpainted, right? After it was glued back together, the entire section here, this entire section here and here and here and here, was overpainted, right? So we're really no longer looking at the original layer of Rembrandt. Certainly in the curtain over here, there is something else underneath. And the question is, of course, is what? We have an idea of cross-sections. We do know that in some places we're looking at the original curtain, which shows up on the surface. In these cross-sections, we know that it contains a pigment called smalt, which is a cobalt-doped pigment that was used a lot in the days of Rembrandt. And we know that in the overpainting, this smalt pigment is missing, right? Cobalt-containing glass is missing. So what we did is we scanned, again, this section here with X-ray fluorescence scanning, and here you see the radiography section, which doesn't reveal anything. But here you see that quite a lot of original material is actually present underneath that iron-containing retouch layer, right? So because of this image here, which shows that large amounts of the original material are still present, the conservators are right now moving ahead and are taking away that 19th century overpainting, because based on this image they know that original material is still there. I mentioned earlier that we're making quite a lot of use of synchrotron-based XRF stations, which is a bit cumbersome because you have to move these paintings to synchrotron sites, which is logistically a nightmare, I can tell you. So over the past couple of years, my co-workers Koen Janssens and Matthias Aalveld from the University of Antwerp and I have been working on trying to turn this into a portable system, which is much slower, so we have to scan longer, but we can do it on location, which is a big step forward. Many paintings really can't travel. We published this recently. Here you see our earlier work based on synchrotron data, and this is an image that we were able to achieve with our portable system, which is not as nice, not as brilliant, but it's still very good from an imaging point of view. Then the next step came last year, and we're very happy to collaborate with Brooker AXS to have come up with this really nice instrument, the M6 Jetstream, developed together with Brooker University of Antwerp and Delft University of Technology. This is a commercial system that can now be bought, and it can really cover large surfaces, 80 by 60 centimeters. We have, the time is not there now to talk about that in detail, but we're working hard to reduce the acquisition time. We can now scan paintings in a couple of hours, right, with very high, so 50 micrometer resolution. And we're going to take this machine in the next couple of years to various museums. So we have this nice road trip planned for the couple of next months, and we'll start with a visit to the Getty Museum in November. to look at various other paintings. So we're really excited about that. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk, but not before thanking the sponsors of this research. Louis Vertegaal, who gave a talk earlier at the opening, is responsible for a big NWO investment in this type of work. I would also like to thank the European Commission, my co-workers, and thank you for your attention.